Berry Gordy listened to the record once. Then he put it down and said it would never be released. He called it the worst thing he had ever heard. The man who made it disagreed, and he was willing to lose everything to prove it. Why did Marvin Gaye risk his entire career, his contract, his income, his relationship with the man who made him a star for a single album? And what did Berry Gordy say when that album became the fastest-selling record in Motown history? If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to Soul Legends Untold. Let us know in the comments which legend's story you'd like to hear next.
Detroit, Michigan, 1965. Marvin Gaye was sitting in a recording studio at Hitsville, USA, when a disc jockey interrupted his song on the radio. The song was Pretty Little Baby. It had been climbing the charts. Marvin had recorded it the way Motown asked: clean, polished, romantic, the kind of record that moved units and did not make anyone uncomfortable, the kind of record Berry Gordy had built an empire on. But the DJ was not talking about the song. He was reporting live from the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, where the streets had been on fire for 4 days. 34 people were dead, 1,000 were injured. The National Guard had been called in, and outside the window of whatever room the radio was playing in, America was doing what it had been doing for years, pretending it could hold the pressure down forever. Marvin heard it. He put his head down and did not say anything for a long time. He would tell his biographer, David Ritz, about that moment years later. He said, "With the world exploding around me, how am I supposed to keep singing love songs?" Marvin Pence G. Gaye, Jr. had grown up in Washington, D.C., the son of a Pentecostal minister whose household ran on discipline and silence and the ever-present threat of punishment. His father, Marvin Gaye, Sr., was a man of contradictions, preacher and drinker, authoritarian and absent, capable of warmth and capable of cruelty in equal measure. The son grew up singing in his father's church because it was the only place in the house where something like joy was permitted. He added the E to his last name when he became an artist, a small act of self-creation that said more about his relationship with his origins than any interview ever did. By the time he arrived at Motown in 1961, Marvin Gaye already knew how to make himself acceptable to people who held power over him. He had learned that in childhood. He knew how to read a room. He knew when to push and when to wait. He knew that the man at the top of any institution believed they understood more than they did, and the fastest way to lose everything was to tell them so directly.
So he waited. He recorded the love songs, he cashed the checks, he watched the country through the studio window and said nothing out loud about what he saw. He kept singing them anyway. For 5 more years, he gave Motown exactly what Motown wanted. I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Ain't No Mountain High Enough, 11 top 10 singles between 1963 and 1969. He wore the suits they picked, he smiled for the cameras, he performed on the stages they booked, he attended the Motown parties and said the right things to the right people and did not make the kind of trouble that would cost the label money or attention it did not want. He was, by every measurable standard, one of the most successful artists in America. And he was quietly suffocating. The problem was not the music itself. Marvin Gaye loved music the way some people love breathing, not as a choice, but as a biological requirement. The problem was the cage around the music. Motown's formula was airtight and deliberate. No controversy, no politics, nothing that might cost the label a radio station or a corporate sponsor. Berry Gordy had built his company on the idea that black music could reach white America if it was packaged carefully enough. And he was not wrong. The sales figures proved it every quarter. But the packaging had a cost. and by 1969, the cost had become too high for the man paying it. What Marvin wanted was simple and, inside the walls of Motown, almost impossible. He wanted to make music that told the truth about what he was seeing. Not the truth about heartbreak and romance and Saturday night. He had told that truth 100 times. The truth about the country outside the studio window. The truth about Vietnam. The truth about what was happening on the streets of Detroit and Los Angeles and every other American city where the distance between what the country promised and what it delivered had grown too wide to ignore. Berry Gordy had not built Motown on that kind of truth, and he was not, in the fall of 1969, interested in starting.
Then came Tammi Terrell. Marvin and Tammi had recorded together since 1967. Their duets, Ain't No Mountain High Enough, Your Precious Love, You're All I Need to Get By, were some of the warmest recordings Motown ever produced. On stage, they moved around each other like people who had known each other in a previous life. Offstage, Marvin called her one of the only people in the industry he completely trusted. On July 14, 1967, in the middle of a concert in Hampton, Sydney, Virginia, Tammi Terrell collapsed in Marvin's arms on stage. She had a brain tumor. The diagnosis came quickly. The prognosis was worse. Over the next 2.5 years, Marvin visited her in the hospital as often as he could. He sat with her through the surgeries, 8 of them in total. He held her hand when she could not speak. He watched her lose the things that had made her Tammi, the voice, the energy, the laugh, while her body held on longer than anyone expected, and her spirit refused, until almost the very end, to stop fighting. On March 16, 1970, Tammi Terrell died. She was 24 years old. Marvin Gaye did not perform for the rest of that year. He did not answer most phone calls. He spent his days at home or at the baseball diamond, where he sometimes went alone to think, sitting in the empty stands long after anyone else had left. People who knew him during that period said he was not grieving in any way they recognized. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere the music had not yet followed him. But the music was still there, waiting, gathering itself around something that had not yet arrived. That something came unexpectedly through a soldier named Renaldo Benson.
Renaldo Benson was a member of the Four Tops. In the spring of 1970, he had been watching news coverage of the Kent State shootings, 4 college students killed by National Guardsmen on a campus in Ohio, and the images had not left him. He wrote a song about what he saw. He brought it to his own group first. The Four Tops passed. He brought it to Joan Baez. She passed too. Then Benson brought it to Marvin Gaye. He came with a co-writer named Al Cleveland and the skeleton of a melody. The song was called What's Going On. It was about a Vietnam veteran coming home to a country he no longer recognized, about looking at the streets and the headlines and the faces of the people around you and asking the simplest, most unanswerable question available: what is happening here? Marvin took the song and made it his own. He rewrote most of the lyrics. He added his brother Frankie's voice to the emotional core of it. Frankie had served in Vietnam, had come home changed in ways he struggled to put into words, and the long conversations that 2 brothers had during those years gave the song a weight that no amount of craft alone could have produced. This was not a protest song written from a safe distance. This was a letter written from inside the wound. The recording sessions at Hitsville, USA ran through the summer of 1970 with an atmosphere that the musicians who were there would later describe as unlike anything they had experienced on a Motown session before. There was no clock on the wall that mattered. There was no A&R man in the booth watching the budget. Marvin moved through the studio like a man who had finally been given permission to be exactly who he was, and the musicians around him responded to that freedom the way musicians always respond to an artist who is fully present. They played better than they knew they could. James Jamerson, the Motown bassist whose melodic lines had underpinned dozens of hits without ever receiving the credit his playing deserved, played on the sessions. Marvin later said that Jamerson understood immediately what the record was trying to do, not because anyone explained it to him, because the music explained itself. He recorded the title track at Hitsville, USA in June of 1970. Then he kept recording. He had more to say than one song could hold. The album took shape through the summer and fall. Marvin produced it himself, the first time he had sole producer credit on a Motown record. He layered the tracks differently from anything the label had released before. Overlapping voices that sometimes spoke at the same time, the way people talk when something urgent is happening. Jazz-inflected arrangements that breathed and shifted and did not stay in the lanes Motown had built. Songs that flowed into each other without clean breaks, the way a conversation flows, the way a mind moves through grief and anger and hope without stopping to announce each transition. He put the session musicians' names on the album jacket. Motown almost never did that. Marvin wanted people to know who had been in the room. He wanted the record to feel like a document as much as a product. When he finished, he called Berry Gordy. Gordy was on vacation in the Bahamas. He reached him there, his voice barely able to stay at a normal volume. He told Gordy what he had made. He told him it was something new, something that mattered in a way their other records did not, something the world needed to hear. Gordy's response was immediate and did not leave room for argument. "Marvin, why do you want to ruin your career?"
Gordy flew back and listened to the recordings in California. His verdict did not soften. He called What's Going On the worst thing he had ever heard in his life. He told Harry Balk, an executive in Motown's creative department who had already received an acetate copy by mistake and fallen completely in love with it, that the song was too jazzy, too old, cluttered with what Gordy called that Dizzy Gillespie stuff in the middle. He said the scatting would confuse radio programmers. He said the political content would alienate the mainstream audience that Motown had spent a decade carefully assembling one hit single at a time. The album, he decided, would not be released. Not the single, not any of it. Marvin Gaye's response was quiet and absolute. He stopped recording. Not as a dramatic gesture for the cameras, not as a short-term negotiating tactic designed to produce a quick compromise. He simply stopped. He told the label that he would not enter a studio, would not produce new material, would not fulfill any further contractual obligations until What's Going On was released. Motown had a full roster of artists. They had product in the pipeline, but they did not have another Marvin Gaye, and everyone on both sides of the argument understood that fact clearly. The standoff held for months. Meanwhile, Harry Balk had not given up. Balk had received his acetate copy of the single by accident. It had been misdirected on its way to the quality control department. He had played it once and understood immediately what Gordy apparently could not see. This was not a career-ending experiment from an artist who had lost his way. This was a masterpiece. Balk went to Barney Ailes, Motown's vice president of sales, and made his case quietly and carefully. Ailes agreed. Together, without Gordy's knowledge or his approval, they pressed 100,000 copies of the single and sent them to radio stations across the country on January 17, 1971. Within a week, demand had consumed all 100,000 copies. They pressed another 100,000 to answer it. 200,000 copies in 7 days. Gordy found out after the fact. He was, by all accounts, satisfied by the numbers. Whether he said anything specific about the decision to go around him is not clearly recorded. Some silences carry their own answer. The full album, What's Going On, was released on May 21, 1971. It sold 100,000 copies on the first day alone. It was the fastest-selling album in Motown's history, faster than anything Diana Ross had released, faster than the Jackson 5, faster than the Temptations at the peak of their commercial power. Critics who had spent years writing respectfully but carefully about Motown's polished product suddenly found themselves reaching for different language. Peter Shapiro described it as having changed the shape and direction of pop music. Time magazine would call it one of the most important records of the century. Rolling Stone would eventually rank it the greatest album ever made. Not the greatest soul album, not the greatest album of its decade, the greatest album, full stop, from any artist in any genre at any time. The record did everything Berry Gordy had been afraid it would do. It was political. It was uncomfortable in the way that honest things are uncomfortable. It asked questions that did not have easy answers and did not pretend otherwise. It talked about Vietnam and poverty and ecological destruction and police violence and the specific, grinding despair of watching a country fail the people it was supposed to protect. And none of that cost Motown a single radio station. None of it drove away the mainstream. The mainstream came to it because Marvin Gaye had understood something about his audience that the institution around him had not fully grasped. People do not only want to be entertained. Sometimes they want someone to say, clearly and without apology, the thing that has been sitting in their chest for years without a name. What's Going On gave it a name. At the end of the recording, during the final mix of the title track, as the song was fading out, Marvin Gaye put his hand on the studio fader and pushed the volume back up to full. The false ending, a song appearing to finish and then surging back, was not in anyone's plan. Many people who were there that day understood it exactly for what it was. Not a technical decision, not an aesthetic choice, a statement. The man Berry Gordy had told would ruin his career by making this record was saying, in the most direct musical language available, "You thought this was over. It was not over." In the years that followed, Marvin Gaye would make more essential records: Let's Get It On, I Want You, Midnight Love. He would also carry the weight of tax deaths and broken marriages and long periods of silence that the music could not always reach. He would spend years in self-imposed exile in Belgium, sitting with the wreckage and trying to find the thread back. He would be killed by his own father on April 1, 1984, one day before his 45th birthday. But the album remained. It outlasted the label politics and the personal disasters and the silence. It found new listeners in every decade that followed because the questions at its center did not age. What's going on? 3 words Marvin Gaye was willing to lose everything to say out loud. The institution said no. The audience said otherwise. And sometimes the most important thing a person can do is refuse to let the wrong answer stand. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Let us know in the comments. We'll see you in the next story.